So hi, this is JavaScript and Web Standards 2, the Quickening. Are there any Highlander fans out here, the movie Highlander? Yeah, a few, okay, cool. Well, I'm only gonna reference it once in this presentation because I realized that I don't think a lot of people like Highlander, so we're gonna stick mostly with Star Wars, but there'll be a Highlander metaphor, so get ready for it. So I'm Jenn Lukas, and I am an interactive development director at a small web design studio. I focus mainly in front-end development, but because we have a small studio, I've done some information architecture, design reviews, CMS implementations. We sort of all dabble in each other's jobs. And I work at a company called HappyCog, and it was founded by this guy, Jeffrey Zeldman, and he wrote a book, Designing with Web Standards. We also publish alistapart.com, which is an online magazine for people who make websites, and we do a conference, an event apart a few times a year. So at HappyCog, we work with a bunch of different clients from the Holocaust Museum in the US to Mozilla, Georgetown, Zappos, and Dictionary.com, which actually you saw earlier. I also blog sporadically about 80s music, unicorns, and my web crushes at jenlukas.com. And I contribute to the nerdery.net, which is a website for developers. And lastly, I love web standards. I think I'm losing this. Okay, I think it's stuck in my hair now. So web standards is this idea of the set of guidelines that provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of web users. And the idea goes on to illustrate that by using web standards, you'll lower the cost of production. So by building on a solid foundation, there's less upkeep in the future. So when websites and browsing devices evolve, you'll still be ready for it. So, my Highlander metaphor. In the movie Highlander, there's a group of immortals that fight to the death, which kind of doesn't make sense, but they do. And they kill each other by beheading is the only way. And when they do it, there's like these giant lightning bolts come down, and it's called the Quickening, and there's all this action. And they always say, there can be only one. And it's really dramatic, and it's kind of awesome. So there can be only one, but not really. The stuff I'm going to talk about today is how I like to make websites. The people that come to us because we do standard support. This isn't going to be applicable to every project that you do, but for me, this is how I believe in making the web. So not all these rules are set in stone, but with that in mind, my favorite rule is your site should work without JavaScript. The sites that I work on, the most important aspects of the site aren't the graphic design or the animations or the CMS implementation, it's the content. And so we want to make sure that our content is accessible to everyone, including users that don't have JavaScript enabled. And of course, we do that with our good friend, progressive enhancement. And we all know that's XHTML plus your CSS plus your JavaScript, or your content, your presentation, and your behavior. So why do we do this? Well, we talked about the importance of content, but really, how many people are we worried about? Who really turns off JavaScript anymore? Well, first, let me get my audience participation going on here and ask you one of my favorite questions. How many of you guys test for Safari? How many of you all test for Chrome? And how many of you test for Opera? Yeah. And how many of you test your sites without JavaScript? Okay, a couple. Different sites are going to give you different stats on this, but here's a few. And you'll see that the numbers for users without JavaScript are actually larger than the numbers of people that use a certain browser, Safari. And I get it, stats, you can read them how you will. But now I'm going to ask you another question. How many of you ride bikes? Oh, no one rides bikes. Okay, here's a few. And let's pretend you were to ride a bike. If you were to ride a bike, how many of you would ride a bike with a helmet? Okay, a couple. How many of you would ride a bike with a helmet if you were only going a couple of blocks? Okay, bad metaphor. So I always ride a bike with a helmet back at home because I can't control what other people are doing. So pedestrians could be running across the street, and drivers in Philadelphia are kind of crazy, and I can't control what other people are going to do, so all I can do is protect myself. So if I'm coding a website, and there's only one person that's browsing it without JavaScript, but that person is the president of the company of the site that I'm working for, well then I'm going to make sure that they can view the content. I recently was working on a project, and one of the main stakeholders only tested the site primarily on the iPad. And That's fine. Our site should still work on the iPad, but it just was new to us to have someone primarily focused on something as opposed to Firefox or Internet Explorer. So making sure your site works without JavaScript now, make sure it will work without JavaScript later. So if the Kindle pre-pad 8G Megatouch pod comes out one day and it doesn't support JavaScript, you'll be all set. And while there have been improvements in how search engines want to handle JavaScript, the most foolproof method to making sure you get the best SEO to read the content is to have it on the page to begin with. So I'll be the first to admit that I really rushed the code on my personal site. You know, it's got unicorns, it's kind of silly, and when I look at the CSS, it really kind of makes me cringe a little bit. I rushed through it. I used to be really careful about making sure my YouTube video's embed, but now I'll just go on a kick and I'll just start copying and pasting and nothing validates anymore. So I'm guilty of it too. But if I'm ever looking to hire someone, the first thing I'm going to do is go to their personal site. I'm going to see how it works with text resizing. I'm going to view source, and then I'm going to see how it works with JavaScript disabled. So if you want to make sure that your site is a reflection of yourself, then that's something that I would think about doing. And then there's some of us that find that reading the W3C docs is a great way to spend a Friday night. And I'm sort of guilty of this. I really like guidelines. So making sure that your site works without JavaScript is complying with the WCAG recommendations. And they require that your content and functionality be accessible with scripting disabled, and that users should be alerted if JavaScript changes any content on the page. So back to who turns off JavaScript anyway. You know, JavaScript can be a pretty scary thing to the users of the interwebs. It's got a history of being the sneaky guy on the block and breaking your browsing and unresponsive scripts and errors and those alerts that you can't ever get out of. So I have a confession to make. I was working on this, and last week I started thinking, I'm like, is this even true anymore? It seems like JavaScript's really sort of mellowed out, and everyone's sort of been like, oh, it's not that creepy, it's okay, JavaScript. And then the next morning, I was on the bus on the way to work, and I was checking my Twitter on my phone, and I see this. And I'm like, what's going on, Simon? You know, what's your beef with the JavaScript? And so then, as I'm sure you all saw, there was some of this going on this week. So then the tweets just kept coming. What's with all the garbage code in my Twitter stream? And what's going on? JavaScript code is automatically sending things. And then you've got the people ready to abandon ship. And then you've got the people ready to make money off this, and I would totally buy one of those t-shirts. Then you have people that were trying to make it work, but unfortunately it didn't work without JavaScript. And then my personal favorite, we've finally gotten somewhere. So when the number 8 most visited site on the internet gets a bad rap like this, that's when people start turning to things like NoScript. And that's when people start turning to things like upping their internet security and turning off JavaScript in their browsers. Let's take a look at some site examples. So here's a design studio, and they've got this really nice moving around, going to things. There's space, there's sky, there's land. There's a contact form. You can fill out the contact form. You can not fill it out and then get error alerts. Really nice. And then seeing this with JavaScript disabled, so I now start on the contact page, and none of the links are working anymore. So I can still contact, maybe. I'm not getting any confirmation messages. But why am I going to contact someone if I can't see their offers or their portfolio? This is another example. And so clicking on About updates the content, but you still have to scroll, so it's a little silly. So you're doing one shortcut, but then still needing to use the scroll bar. And then when you look at the site without JavaScript, and you're clicking on these links, nothing's happening. So here's a navigation that's not working. And then I notice that there is still a scroll bar up here. So I can still scroll down and get the content. So that's one step better, because we're still able to access this. Though I've got this navigation that's really confusing to a user because it doesn't work. And then I'm also noticing I've got this weird horizontal scroll. So what does this thing do? And so I scroll down, oh, look, here's a help desk form. And so just by making sure the navigation works or jumps to something and making sure that your styling is okay is a step on how they could have made this better. My text editor of choice is Coda. I love it. I think it's fantastic. And this is their website. And you can browse through to see the stuff it does. It's got this nice, neat interface. You can use the arrows to scroll through or the tabs. And then when I disable JavaScript and refresh the page, I can still get to the content. But it does this weird jumping down thing. So now I have to scroll back up every time I want to change something, which is really distracting as a user. I just want to learn about your product. I want to buy it, but it's really confusing. And then I still have these arrows here that are trying to call this JavaScript, but of course nothing's happening. So a way that they can improve this is you want to write your arrows to the page with JavaScript and not include it in the source where it's not going to work for someone. So let's say your site's just not going to work with JavaScript. It's just not. That's not your audience. It's fine. Well, this is a site for RDO, and this is what happens when you come to this site with JavaScript on. Without it, you get an error message telling you that you need to have JavaScript enabled. So fine, at least I know it's not user error when I come to this site, which is nice. It's giving me a message, I'm not doing anything wrong, I do need to have JavaScript. It's a little harsh. Here's another site. It's a design site. And this goes about it a little bit nicer. And so it says, JavaScript is disabled in your current web browser, exclamation. Because parts of the site are coded with JavaScript, certain features might not be available to you. If you have the possibility, please activate JavaScript, exclamation. So you still can access some of the other content on the site, but you also have this really nice, polite message that doesn't make you feel like a jerk for having JavaScript disabled. This is what happens if you come to Facebook without JavaScript. And again, you get an error message, and it's highlighted in yellow, so you're automatically drawn to it. But the thing with this is if you can't turn on JavaScript, you're still able to access the site because they let you have access to the mobile version. So you can sign in, and you can still know that the Phillies are playing or that someone has poked you, but that's kind of creepy, so I actually wish they'd get rid of that. Moving on, your site should be keyboard accessible. Users with visual disabilities have a strong reliance on the keyboard, as well as users who just choose to use the keyboard for speed or convenience. This is another part of adhering to web standards. And when users hover over an event and it pops up an information box or pulls in an Ajax menu, sometimes we forget to copy that over to the focus as well. Along with that, your site should also be screen reader accessible. So updates are often missed by people with assistive technologies because they expect a change to happen with a navigate event. So if you click on a link or you submit a form is usually when you expect something to change. So web apps often use these techniques to update content in the background, and then users are unaware of it. This demo is really cool. It's a Lightbox effects using Jquery UI, and you can go through the images with your keyboard. It's got a nice loader. You can also use your mouse. I don't think it captured my mouse, but I'm clicking. You can escape by either clicking or pressing escape. You can still tab through using your keyboard to all the other photos. And then what's also really neat about this is it updates the URL. So I can grab the URL from this, send it to someone if I want to show them a picture of someone rocking out, and then I can automatically load that URL right away. With JavaScript disabled, this still works. I can still get through with my keyboard access, and I can still go right to the picture. This does something else really neat, and that moves into the next point, is declaring yourself as an application and letting users know that you're an app. So with what all of you all are doing with JavaScript these days and web applications becoming so fancy, it's a bit more complicated to make your content accessible. Web apps are emulating desktop apps, and I don't think a way that anyone, or a lot of people didn't think was possible. And one of the things that's been plaguing the good name of Ajax is that updating the content in the background and not being screen reader accessible. And that's where Aria comes in. And this allows web pages to declare themselves as widgets or applications rather than static documents. They use the role, property, and state information to declare itself as a dynamic web app. Aria also extends the tab index attribute So it goes beyond the A area, button, input, object, select, and text area, where you would normally use those, and allows it to be applied to any element, such as a div or a span. You can also use tab index of -1 here, and that will take things that shouldn't be in the natural tab order out of the flow of the page. So if you have a nested tree item and you don't want anyone to access that right away, it won't be until you programmatically tell it to be. So here's an example of a span that has the tab index defined. And the span is being used as a checkbox element. So you want to keep the tab index of 0 because you still want users to be able to access this with their keyboard. If we'd done -1, again, that would have left it out. You'll also notice here the role attribute. And this is being used here to specify that a span is being used as a checkbox. So role attributes were borrowed from XHTML. And the idea is it allows you to add machine extractable semantic information about the purpose of an element. This paved the way for ARIA to use this and provide role information to assistive technologies. So you can define things like alerts, dialogues, menus, tree items, sliders, buttons, progress meters, etc. Along with that, you can also use roles to define the grid and structure of a document. They're document landmark roles, and they describe the area of the site a user is in. Navigation, article, main, complementary, search, and banner, just to name a few of them. ARIA states and properties tell users how to interact with these widgets. So for a checkbox, you can define whether or not the checkbox is checked by using the ARIA checked property, and you can set it to true or false. Or if you have form fields and some are required, you can let a user know by using ARIA required equals true. And this helps a lot. You go beyond the asterisks that some of us use to define a checkbox or a form field being required, which really doesn't tell a user very much. If items are changed in a document, then ARIA uses live regions, and this lets a user know. They can do this, though, without losing the current place in the site. With ARIA Live, you have 3 choices. You have off, which means the region isn't live. You have polite, which means that users are notified that there's a change, but not interrupted of their current task. And you have assertive for more urgent priority content. So if there's a form error, that's when you'd want to use something like that. You can also use the ARIA busy state, and that lets a user know that content's still being updated. And you can use the ARIA relevant property, and that'll define additions or removals of nodes in the DOM. Aaron Gustafson made this tab interface demo, and it's really awesome, not just because it's about pumpkin pie. But so here's how you make pumpkin pie, and here's how it looks with JavaScript enabled. And you've got your 4 tabs on top, and each one corresponds to the section like ingredients and directions. This is how the site looks without JavaScript. So you'll see all the content still on the page, and taking a look at the source, it's completely semantic. You've got your heading levels with everything corresponding underneath it, and then with JavaScript, it turns it into the tab set. And then you'll see here that you'll see some of the ARIA roles being defined. So the ARIA selected equals true, the role equals tab, the ARIA hidden, and viewed. And it's really nice, and then I don't think I have sound. But if you want to go to this, you guys aren't going to be able to hear that. But with a screen reader, this totally works, and you're able to hear what tab that you're currently on, and you can get to everything that you need to. If anyone's interested in this link, it's up there, or I can send it to you. So next up with JavaScript is you don't want to interrupt the workflow. JavaScript should be used to enhance a user's experience in a website, not distract them or take away. And there's some sites that do this really well. Flickr is one of the most, I love the interaction of this site. It's amazing. I can do so much from my login page without even leaving it. I can add people as contacts or cancel it. I can expand collapse almost everything on this page and get an error, but I still get, not an error, an alert message. This is really neat. If you collapse your groups thing, it updates your message with nothing new here, recently bored, look for a new group. So it's responding to what the user is doing. They're thinking, oh, they're bored of this, so let's give them something they can do. You can refresh content. If you look at your photo stream page, you can update your titles right from there. You can cancel. You could update it to talk about that one of your bosses is eating meat. And then you get this yellow highlight so you know that you've changed something. You can delete things, or you can cancel them with this alert. it's really easy to use, and I don't have to go through 10-page refreshes. Looking at an individual photo page, you can add things right to the map from here. This saves the user so much time, and it's all about these enhancements that make this experience so great. I mean, I can't think of anyone who doesn't like Flickr, and if you do, we can talk about it later, but it's such a neat website. You can add contacts right from here, you can delete contacts right from here, and I think sometimes we take for granted how easy the site is for us, and other sites that make you go jump through hoops in order to be able to do this content. Okay, so Internet Explorer 6. Everything that's HTML5 and CSS3 is really cool these days, and I know a lot of people are moving towards this, like, let's not support IE6 anymore. And that may or may not be right. Again, I work with the types of clients that we're not going to do that. We are going to make sure our sites work in IE6. But you can still do this and push the web forward. Sometimes it's a little bit of double work, but an example of this is making your forms easy to use. And the WCAG 2 guidelines state that you should help users avoid and correct mistakes. And one of the ways that a user majorly interacts with your website is filling out forms, and there's a lot of room for user error. You can use JavaScript to help with some of this with the client-side validation. But in HTML5, there's some really neat new type additions that will help hopefully take some of the burden off of JavaScript. The nice thing about starting to implement these new input types is that if a browser doesn't recognize it, so like type equals search, it'll default back to type equals text. If the validation of things, like making sure a telephone number is in valid format, fell to the browsers instead, it would save developers a lot of time to focus on other things like accessibility and like good interaction. Of course, if you are going to implement any of these, I would still say to do a JavaScript backup for browsers that don't support this. So again, it's sort of double work, but it's moving the web, I think, in a great place. To talk to a little more about search, here's an example of a site in Safari with JavaScript turned on. A lot of people have become really big on using the placeholder attribute these days to fill in the value in a search box. And I see here that the search here is really similar to the search that's built in the browser. So I'm familiar with how this works as a user, and I think that without a submit button, I still think I can type and something will happen. And sure enough, I start typing, and I get my suggested results. Okay, cool, I find what I want, I select it, and here are my nice, neat, organized results. If I look at this page in Firefox with JavaScript off, Firefox doesn't support placeholder, or it didn't on this browser. I still don't think it does. So here, I'm not really sure. Here's a square box. Because I'm a Mac user, maybe they think I know that's a search form because I'm hip to the web. But I go in, I start typing, and nothing happens. But then again, because I'm a Mac user, maybe I'm used to forms, and I can hit enter to submit this form. So it submits, but as you can see, you get a broken experience. And these are places, if you're using the placeholder for things that are more important besides search, like enter a zip code, and you're not sure if you should enter a zip or a state or a country, those are places where you're not going to want to rely on that. I'm going to skip through this because I'm running out of time a little. CSS3 and animations can be your friend. If you were once relying on JavaScript to just add some enhancements, there's some really neat things that you can do these days with the CSS3. Here's a few examples. There's more. If you want to make a nice interface for your Michael Jackson CDs. A tab interface, it's a little wonky at times. If you go between the two tabs, then you'll have this. And of course, if you're not on the first tab, then it's always going to default back to that. This site's really neat. They did a comparison of CSS3 animations with the Jquery equivalents. And you can pop open the code and see what things are like in CSS3, and then see what things are like in the Jquery. So that being said, you should be aware of distracting, unnecessary animations. On a more serious side of that, the WCAG recommendations also limit flashing animations as it can affect people with photosensitive epilepsy. And if you remember a few years back, this happened on an epilepsy support message board, and people injected this code that did produce these animations with JavaScript that had a lot of serious effects on people. On a less serious side, I'm going to skip to this one, sometimes animations are really cool for a design site, and they're going through, and it's really neat. It could be a little bit distracting, but you're probably trying to show off the things that you can do, so it's totally acceptable in this content. But there's still ways that you can make this a bit more accessible. If that navigation on the top was fixed, then someone could easily jump around to content. So go ahead and push the web, but also think about ways to make it more usable. This is a site that does it really nice. The animations are really fast, so you still get the effect of neat little navigating around. And then the site still also works without JavaScript. I won't show you all this to save time, but it'll jump through to the proper place. Choose your visual indicators wisely. When you have JavaScript functionality, and users should know what they're going to do when they click on something or something is happening. So here's a site for some iPad apps, or wow, I just forgot the word, but you get what I'm saying. And you can see when you click on these, it automatically changes the content on the right-hand side. So this happens with almost all of them, except the first two. When you click on them, even though the icons look the same as the rest, these actually open a new page. So as a user, I wasn't expecting that at all based on the rest of the interface. So maybe a little arrow icon or something to let a user know that they're going to be taking off this page that they were just on. Also, you should let your users know something is happening. If your JavaScript's going to take a long time to load something, then use loaders to visually indicate that. Here's another example of a site that does more of these navigational things, but you'll see they pop up that loader to make sure that you know nothing's broken, your computer's thinking, and something's going to change. Another aspect of JavaScript and web standards is share what you have. To push the web forward, it's really nice to be able to share content and how you did things. One of the problems with using a proprietary system like Flash is that unless someone writes one of those demos, you're not going to know how someone made what they made. So here's an asteroids game, and you can download the JavaScript source code, and it's using HTML5 canvas and JavaScript, and it's really cool. But I can still learn how someone made this, and that's going to help teach everyone of how to keep making these really cool things. It's not going to help me be better at asteroids, but besides that, it's still pretty cool. Lastly, this was touched on a bit before, but use JavaScript libraries. They're doing so much ARIA support these days. It's so neat, the stuff that all you guys are making out there. The other great part about using a JavaScript library is for your clients, there's so much documentation about it. When you're writing all your custom stuff, maybe when you're passing that off to a client, they're not going to know how to build on that. When you use a popular library, then people can look up anything and help maintain their own site. And so that about wraps it up, and thank you.